Hello, I'm Bonnie Erbe. Welcome to PBS's To the Contrary. Today, we're taking you on a tour of the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. This historic, beautiful, 200-year-old house in Washington, D.C. was designated a national monument by President Obama in 2016. It is an absolute treasure trove of the history of the women's suffrage movement, with all kinds of documents and all kinds of things that went on in this house that after you watch this, you will wish these walls could talk.
The significance of this house is twofold. First off, it's one of the very historic places in the District of Columbia because it's the oldest house on Capitol Hill. We moved in 1929. At that point, the 19th Amendment, or the Suffrage Amendment, had been passed and ratified, and Alice Paul and her contemporaries moved into this building so that they could start lobbying Congress for the Equal Rights Amendment, which was written in 1923.
What's the history of ownership of the house, and how did it end up being, I guess, donated to the National Women's Party?
So this is the fifth and final headquarters of the National Women's Party. There were 4 others before this. When they were working on the 19th Amendment, they found it important to be close to the White House. So both of those structures were over on Lafayette Park. Then they moved to the old brick Capitol, which is where the Supreme Court is now, just across the street from here. Well, that property was taken from eminent domain when they were building the Supreme Court, so the proceeds from the sale of that property moved us into this property, which is at 2nd Constitution.
The government tried to take the house in the 1970s to tear it down while building the Senate Hard office building next door, but the National Women's Party prevailed, and it was made a national landmark listed on the Historic Registry, meaning it can never be torn down or even renovated without federal approval.
Newer women's groups for suffrage and for women's rights were fighting to try to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. So tell me, in the context of that, what was the fight like in the 70s to keep this building?
In 1913, 1914, 1915, when Alice Paul and her contemporaries were fighting for suffrage, they were considered to be the young, upstart kind of rabble-rousers. They'd just gotten back from Britain, they'd learned about tactics and strategies from the Pankhurst family over there, and then they came here and they started doing wild and crazy things like picketing the White House, which had never been done at that point, had never been done before. So they were always seen as the up-and-comers or the new people on the block. And then by the 1960s and 70s, the women of the National Women's Party were actually quite a bit older. So Alice Paul lived and worked in this house until 1972, and she died in 1977. So by then, they were quite older. So you've got these young groups, and that was the National Organization of Women and other organizations that were forming for equal rights for women's rights at that time. When they tried to take this house, there were plenty of people that stood up and said, oh, we absolutely cannot have that happen. This is the women's voting house. This is where, equal rights for women has been fought for decades and decades.
In the 1990s, it went from being a lobbying organization to becoming an educational institution, a museum for the National Women's Party and for suffrage.
In 2016, President Obama designated this house as a national monument, so it is now officially the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument. And at that point, National Park Service became the owners of the actual physical property. We still own the collection. So right now we have over 1,000 textiles. So some of those are huge. They're 8 by 10 feet, huge banners that were used when they marched in parades, all the way down to very small snippets of fabric that were smuggled out of the Occoquan workhouse when the women were jailed and forced fed there for picketing the White House.
You say we. Does the National Women's Party still exist?
Yes, we do. Our 100th anniversary is this year in 2016, and we are not fading. We are still working on the unfinished business for women's equality and also working to conserve the priceless pieces in the collection.
What's the reaction of young women when they first see this collection?
People of any age, when they come through for the very first time, they're shocked at the fact that women had to work so hard just in order to achieve the vote, and that it was so recent. Remember, it's less than 100 years since we were able to get the right to vote. What is surprising is that they were jailed and then they went on protests, hunger strikes, and they were force-fed. So that's a very violent history, and a lot of people are very shocked by that. They think, how could that have happened here in America less than 100 years ago? It seems crazy. It doesn't seem like it should be possible, and yet it really is. The other thing that people are very stunned by is the fact that the Equal Rights Amendment, while it did pass, was never ratified. The most people that come through do believe that it is a federal amendment to the Constitution, and it's not.
Jennifer Krafchick, the deputy director of the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, shows us the collection.
We're in the room now that contains most of the memorabilia and the historical articles that having to do with early suffrage. So let's start with this chair over here. Why
Sure.
is it in the house? What does it mean?
This chair belonged to Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Stanton was one of the earliest public activists for women's suffrage in the United States. So the first official call for women's right to vote came in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, with Lucretia Mott and many other women, came together to call for the right to vote, call for rights in education, marriage, owning property. So that was really the first official call to action for women's suffrage.
And about how old were Susan B. Anthony and the other original leaders of the Seneca Falls Convention?
At the time of the
convention?
I think Elizabeth was probably in her 30s when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
So Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, and so many other women were part of that early movement.
Mm-hmm. And what is that?
This is an 1897 automatic voting machine. It is one of the earliest automatic voting machines that exists. It's from New York, and it actually has the question, shall women be given the right to vote? And of course, women did not receive the right to vote in New York until 1917. And we have Susan B. Anthony's desk. This was actually a gift to Alice Paul in 1913 by Anthony's former assistant secretary. And she gave it to the National Woman's Party and to Alice Paul specifically in honor of all of the work that they had done. The National Woman's Party was very good about honoring the pioneers of the suffrage movement and really showcasing the work that they did and kind of carrying it forward.
And what's the most significant thing that Alice Paul ever wrote while at this desk?
I think they really revered this desk. I'm not sure how much use it actually received. I imagine that Alice Paul probably sat down in it and worked at it from time to time, but I also think they probably saw it as a piece of history. The National Woman's Party wasn't very active in preserving its own history, but they certainly recognized the importance of artifacts like this in their daily work. So I would imagine that it probably served as a source of inspiration for the party. The Congressional Union for Women's Suffrage, or the National Woman's Party as it was later called, grew out of the British suffrage movement. And Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, and many other American suffragists actually got their start in Great Britain. So what you see here is sort of some of the pieces that we use to tell that story. They were American women. Alice Paul specifically was studying over in Great Britain. She happened to meet Emmeline Pankhurst. She was the founder of the Women's Social and Political Union, which was a more militant suffrage organization. And Alice Paul was hooked. She saw a speech and started working with the group and was arrested 3 times while over in Great Britain and went on hunger strikes while there as well. Several of the other key figures within the National Woman's Party were also jailed while over there. The British suffrage movement was all about sort of action now. And it was very militant. There were rocks thrown through windows, there were protests in Parliament, there were fires set throughout the city. I mean, it was a very, very violent movement. A woman died when she ran at the King's horse. It was certainly something that the United States suffragists saw as necessary to bring to the United States to kind of jumpstart the movement.
But was there ever rock throwing or fire set in the United States?
Not here. Well, they did burn President Wilson's speeches in front of the White House, but it was much more peaceable than it would have been over in Great Britain. So they didn't bring all of the radical tactics.
Show us what you think are the most 1 or 2 important artifacts that you have.
This piece is a broadside calling women to a deputation held right outside of Parliament where they could lobby for the right to vote. And this particular deputation was held on November 22nd, I think it was around 1907, 1908, and it was the day before, or days before, a hugely violent outburst actually erupted, and many women and men were hurt. Those fires were set. I mean, the city was really in chaos as a result of sort of what came out of this particular deputation. This is really the most iconic piece in our collection. It's called the jail door pin. Alice Paul gave these to every woman who was imprisoned here in the United States while working for suffrage. So more than 100 pins were given out to women who were imprisoned and who went on hunger strikes. And she got the idea because she received a pin while she was over in Great Britain from the Pankhursts. So she brought that idea here to the United States. And there are very few that exist in museums today. On March 3rd, 1913, the day before President Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, Alice Paul and members of the Congressional Union staged this parade in Washington, D.C. And the idea was that they would draw as many crowds as possible away from the president who was arriving at Union Station that day. The parade started at the U.S. Capitol, led by Inez Milholland Beausoban on a white horse, and you can see she's very Joan of Arcian in her garb there. And it was to end on the steps of the Treasury with a big pageant that talked about the ideals of liberty and justice and freedom. So that's how it was supposed to go, but it didn't quite work out that way. 5,000 women marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. The crowds that were to attend the inauguration the next day are surrounding them, thousands of people. And the parade actually essentially ends in violence. People threw things, called names, and then ultimately the crowds converged on Pennsylvania Avenue. The Fort Myer cavalry had to be called in because the police presence wasn't strong enough that day. And more than 100 people were sent to the hospital, and the police chief was fired as a result of the parade. But what's really important, what's critical about this piece is that this was the turning point in the U.S. suffrage movement.
The women's suffrage movement was pretty much arch enemies with President Woodrow Wilson, right?
He definitely wasn't an active supporter and wasn't a vocal supporter at all. Ultimately, he ended up turning his attention to suffrage and actively working to get it passed as a war measure in the later part of the teens. His refusal to meet with the women in late 1916 was what sparked the picketing at the White House in 1917. So these are among about 1,500 textiles that we have in our collection. And this cape and hat in particular, we believe, were worn for pageants and parades, some of the bigger spectacles that the National Women's Party or some of the other organizations would have staged. And you'll notice in particular with these are purple, white, and gold, which were the official colors of the National Women's Party.
Yeah, there is gold here.
There is gold, so you could probably wear it either way. The purple stood for the glory of womanhood, the white for purity in home and politics, and the gold for the crown of victory.
So please tell me about the hat. Was it the style of the day, or did they make this specifically for one of the pageants, one of the plays?
Mm-hmm. They did. They made it. They would have made it specifically for one of their pageants or one of their parades. So it would have been the style with whatever they were interpreting. But this particular hat, it's hand sewn in places, and as you noticed, it's also a little bit machine sewn, but very hastily put together. You can kind of see on the back of it how quickly they kind of nobbled this together. Whereas the cape is much more, it's well made, it's machine made. But these were not necessarily meant to last. They were meant to be done quickly and to get as many as possible. They would create pageants and plays for big events. So during the March 3rd, 1913 parade, for instance, they had a big pageant to cap things off. When they introduced the Equal Rights Amendment in 1923, they did it at Seneca Falls as a sort of tribute to past suffragists, and they held a big pageant, a big play at that time, espousing the ideals of the movement.
Okay, so tell me about the significance of this banner.
Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage was a very common slogan that they would put on their banners. It was a direct call to action for the president. This is something that really came out at the beginning of their pickets at the White House. So in January of 1917, the women begin picketing after they refused a meeting by Woodrow Wilson. And this is really the first slogan that is used as they stand silently in front of the White House.
Please tell me about this banner.
This is the Draft Day picket banner. It was used during a parade specifically on September 4th, 1917. And this particular banner is rare in our collection. We really don't have many of the banners that were much more direct in calling the president out on the hypocrisy of fighting for democracy abroad while not doing it here in the United States during World War I, because most of those banners were destroyed. So in April of 1917, the United States entered World War I. And as you may remember, women put the movement on hold during the Civil War. So Alice Paul was absolutely not going to do that when the United States entered World War I in 1917. So by June of 1917, their pickets at the White House were seen as unpatriotic and threatening in some ways. Their banners became a little bit more aggressive. People started gathering a little bit more, and riots started to break out. So people would throw things. The banners would be torn from their hands, and police began arresting the women for obstructing traffic. And they were taken to jail, and they were sentenced for anywhere from 3 days to 6 months. But this was consistent from 1917 all the way to 1919. So these pickets really continued off and on during that entire period. And Alice Paul was even arrested herself in October of 1917, and she was put in an asylum because they believed she had a persecution mania against President Wilson.
The women really did suffer in this movement, and this picture is about that.
So the women who were going on hunger strikes were fighting against the conditions in which they were being put. And Dora was one of the older women who was fighting for suffrage at that time. So you can kind of see this is a situation where she had gone on a hunger strike and then been force-fed and had to be helped out. Some of our pictures even show women being wheeled out on stretchers. So, I mean, very, very powerful, and certainly very negative attention being drawn to the fact that nobody was doing anything to help this situation.
Jennifer, what are these for?
This is the Congressional Voting Card Index. For every member of Congress, the National Woman's Party kept a card or a series of cards on these men. It was referred to at one point as the Deadly Political Index, and it was really the inspiration for lobbying tactics today. They knew everything about these guys, whether they were voting for the suffrage amendment, whether they were likely to be reelected again, because why spend time on somebody who's not going to get reelected? I just want to read you one because
please.
It's fascinating.
And tell us the senator and where he was from and
this
the date.
Is Fred Dominick from South Carolina. He was a Democrat. He is, and his position on the Equal Rights Amendment is vigorously opposed. The purpose of the interview was to secure a hearing on the Equal Rights Amendment before the House Judiciary Committee, and he was interviewed by a woman named Mary Moss Welborn. And her comment about him is, so violently opposed as to be even hostile in his attitude, almost insulting in his insinuation that we are abnormal women because we do not want to be protected as we should be. Quote, the normal woman knows her place, unquote, he says. There is no hope for him, I am sure, and he should be avoided as far as possible. He opposes the amendment on the grounds of states' rights and also on the principle of the everlasting inferiority of women. Can you imagine?
We're up on the second floor now. Tell me about this collection.
This house was not only a headquarters for the National Woman's Party, but it was also a boarding house for many of its members. Alice Paul lived here from 1929 until 1972, and many of the members used this as a place to stay when they were in D.C. lobbying for the Equal Rights Amendment, which is what they worked for from this house.
And so tell me about the Allender collection.
Nina Allender was the official cartoonist for the National Woman's Party. She drew for them from 1914 up until 1927, and her work appeared weekly on the covers of The Suffragist and Equal Rights, which were the weekly publications of the National Woman's Party. Nina Allender really changed the way women were portrayed, particularly in political cartoons of the time. Oftentimes, when male artists were depicting women in their cartoons, the women were seen as haggard and ugly and deformed in some way. And Allender really changed that. She created a figure that she called the Allender Girl, which is just this very stance. You see her, she is a woman who's politically in control, she's independent, she's intelligent, and she's ready to literally throw her hat in the ring. And this image is called Our Hat is in the Ring. And it was done in 1916. And you see her in a very strong stance. She's also very feminine, so she's drawn the way that she actually would have looked. And then you can see the politicians in the corner here. They're actually given the deformities. So she really flipped the political cartoons of the period on their head. Allender's work was just like political cartoons of today. She would tie into current events. So women picketing the White House, for instance, she would show women picketing the White House with their banners, and she would show the words that they were using on the banners. She used the donkey and the elephant and Uncle Sam in a lot of her work. She depicted issues of war, poverty, child labor.
Here we are in the archives, sort of in the basement, the underbelly of the building, if you will. And you have all kinds of records and books stored here.
Yeah.
Tell me about what you've taken out to show us.
First, I'll say that this is the Florence Bayard Hillis Feminist Library. It's the first feminist library in the country. We have books, photographs, textiles, cartoons, original publications, records, all kinds of things in this space. We have everything in this space from letters written by early suffragists like Lucy Stone. We also have more Nina Allender cartoons and cartoons by other artists as well. So on the table I have sort of a smattering of political cartoons as well. And then the one thing we didn't talk too much about yet is the publications of the National Woman's Party. Equal Rights was their publication from 1923 until 1954, and The Suffragist was their publication from 1914 until 1921.
Tell me about some of these telegrams and such.
Yeah, these are great. So I just put a few things on the table that show the support for the Equal Rights Amendment. So I have a telegram on the table that was sent by Nelson Rockefeller to, it says, "I am pleased to have an opportunity to reaffirm the stand I have taken consistently in support of equal rights for all women."
And here's a telegram to
and this
Miss
is
Alice Paul.
Alice Paul from George Romney in support of the amendment for equal rights. And the National Woman's Party would often reproduce these telegrams and send them out to their membership to kind of consistently show that they did have support around the ERA, because it was a rather controversial amendment even then. And so they wanted to make sure that their members had materials to distribute in support of. Also, they would ask members of Congress to sign on in support of the amendment. So they would use things like this piece here. It says, "If elected to the United States Senate, I promise to vote and work actively for the immediate submission to the states of the Equal Rights Amendment." So things like that,
And
where they would encourage support.
They got congressmen and senators to sign this.
Absolutely.
Right.
So all part of their lobbying tactics and strategies. These are specific, particularly around the movement for abolition. So this is a book that was published in 1898, Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women. And this was a compilation of writings by a woman named Mary S. Parker, and it was put together by abolitionist and suffragist Sarah Grimke. This is a piece that is about Harriet Tubman. She was very active during the war. I believe she was a spy at one point, and so this is a report in the House of Representatives where she was trying to receive some money for the work that she did during the Civil War. She was unsuccessful in that effort, but we have this piece in our collection right now on loan so that we can showcase Harriet Tubman, in particular because she may be on the $20 bill at some point. And then we have one of the sashes from our collection, which is just fabulous. And then one other piece of our collection that's in particularly very special is our scrapbook collection. We have more than 70 scrapbooks that chronicle the media attention around the suffrage movement from 1909 until 1933, actually.
Do you expect to be getting more material over the years?
We do. We think there's still a lot of material out there in private hands that people will want to donate to an institution like ours. In 1920, there's a banner called the Ratification Banner, and it's filled with stars. For every state that ratified suffrage, they would sew a star on it. And so there's a very iconic image of Alice Paul unfurling the banner on the day Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify. It's a beautiful banner. Nobody knows what happened to it.
What makes you think it's still around? And so maybe it got
Often
thrown out or burned or in a fire?
It wouldn't have been uncommon for women at that time to take it home, store it in their attic. The National Woman's Party didn't really keep its members from pulling things out of the archive or taking textiles with them. So I wouldn't be surprised if it does turn up in somebody's attic at some point. And we're certainly always on the lookout at estate sales and all of the rest of it, just to see. Maybe one day it'll turn up.
So, if any of our viewers find that banner, it could end up back at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument.